Good morning, everyone. This is Jim Ransom, and I'm bringing you another poetry reading session on our weekly Morning Jim broadside, or whatever you want to call it. Let's call it a poetry interlude. That sounds a little classier. But whatever you call it, we're going to have an interesting one today, I think. And I hope everyone is in the mood to be held for ransom. Today we are going to have some poems by John Crowe Ransom, one of the most unique poets of the 20th century. He died in 1974 after a long career. And I'm going to also read some unpublished poems of my own. As I've said before, I'm not actually related to John Crowe Ransom, so if there's a big difference between his poetry and mine, you'll know it's genetic. A little history is probably in order at this point. John Crowe Ransom was a professor for many years at Kenyon College in Ohio. And after his early education, he spent some time at Oxford University in England, and I think that's where elements of his unique poetic style came into being. Then his next stop was to come back to the U.S. and join the faculty at Vanderbilt University, and that would have been in the late 19-teens and in the 1920s, where he and some others who were reacting against Southern sentimentalism in poetry, and also against modernism that was invading the Roaring '20s, christened themselves the Fugitives because they didn't fit into any of those categories that were currently extant. And eventually they published a small journal named The Fugitive, which published only about a dozen issues. At that point, Ransom, who was sort of the leading light in that group, it moved to Kenyon College, and he much later founded the Kenyon Review, which I think is still publishing, and it was a very influential literary journal for many, many years. And other members of the Fugitives at the time that he started that movement were Alan Tate and Robert Penn Warren and a few others, but those all had distinct styles, not the same as Ransom's. Ransom also gained fame as a literary critic, and he was considered to be the founder of what has been called the New Criticism. But that aspect of his history is not germane to his poetry, which we're going to get into here. I'm going to start out by reading a poem by him that's called Bells for John Whiteside's Daughter. And several important elements of his style will be brought out, I think, in the reading of this poem. There was such speed in her little body, and such lightness in her footfall, it is no wonder her brown study astonishes us all. Her wars were breeded in our high window. We looked among orchard trees and beyond where she took arms against her shadow, or harried under the pond the lazy geese, like a snow cloud dripping their snow on the green grass, tricking and stopping, sleepy and proud, who cried in goose, "Alas, for the tireless heart within the little lady with rod that made them rise from their noon apple dreams and scuttle goose fashion under the skies. But now go the bells, and we are ready. In one house we are sternly stopped to say we are vexed at her brown study, lying so primly propped. Well, what has happened here? Well, this delightful young girl who had such lightness in her football and such speed in her little body has died. And all these people are together, and when the bells ring at the chapel, they are ready in the house to sternly say they are vexed at her brown study. They didn't understand why she could have died at the height of her childhood strength, and with her best years ahead of her. Now, this poem shows some characteristics of Ransom's style. The emotions are strictly controlled, even though we're at a funeral. And he doesn't extract any tears from us at all. He just describes the nature of the situation in beautiful poetic diction and nice iambic pentameter. So that's characteristic of John Crowe Ransom. He's above the fray, so to say. He's trying to get away from Southern sentimentalism, but he also doesn't want to be completely unaware of the situation that this family has found itself in. So that's the poem called Bells for John Whiteside's daughter. Now here's another similar poem in that it occurs in the context of a funeral. The woman being buried was an outstanding beauty, but could never find a man who met her standards. And she's appropriately named Emily Hardcastle. And the poem is Emily Hardcastle, Spinster. We shall come tomorrow morning who are not to have her love. We shall bring no face of envy, but a gift of praise and lilies to the stately ceremonial we are not the heroes of. Let the sisters now attend her who are red-eyed, who are wroth. They were younger, she was finer. For they wearied of the waiting, and they married them to merchants, being unbelievers both. I was dapper when I dangled in my pepper and salt. We were only local beauties, and we beautifully trusted if the proud one had to tarry, one would have her by default. But right across the threshold has her grizzled baron come. Let them robe her, bride and princess, who'll go down a leafy archway and seal her to the stranger for his castle in the gloom. Well, what does that all mean? The grizzled baron in the last stanza is, of course, death. And death has taken hold of her before any of the dapper beauties. And when he talks in the third stanza about, I was dapper when I dangled in my pepper and salt, we were only local beauties. He's now talking about himself and some other gentlemen who are at the funeral, who were her suitors, but she never said yes. So that is another very typical poem by John Crowe Ransom. It's very highly controlled emotions, even though it takes place at a funeral. And he explains the situation of Emily Hardcastle. In fact, the title kind of says it all. Emily Hardcastle, spinster. Doesn't that really give it all away? I think so. Now, that came from his selected poems, which was published in 1969. Finally, I'm going to read you another poem of his. It's called Winter Remembered, and it's very ironic. It's a very ironic poem. This poem was recently published in one of the Poem of the Week shows of one of the poetry, I don't remember what poetry online site it was. And perhaps it's better not to tell you what happened. A friend sent me this poem that was online because she knew I was a fan of John Crowe Ransom. And I took one look at it and realized it had been severely altered. The last two stanzas had been taken out and were replaced by a couplet to turn it into a sonnet. The two lines that made up the couplet didn't fit at all. And I'm pretty sure Ransom did not do this. More likely it was an editor who wanted to keep it to a briefer format. How bad is that? Ransom's last book of poems was actually published 4 years after he died in 1974. And I have a copy of it, and the poem that I have in that book was unchanged. And I don't think John Crowe Ransom came and altered it from the grave, do you? But let's read the poem. I'm talking about it, but you know nothing about it at this point. It's called Winter Remembered. Two evils, monstrous either one apart, possessed me, and were long and loath at going, a cry of absence, absence in the heart, and in the wood the furious winter blowing. Think not, when fire was bright upon my bricks, and past the tight boards hardly a wind could enter, I glowed like them, the simple burning sticks, far from my cause, my proper heat and center. Better to walk forth in the frozen air and wash my wounds in the snows. That would be healing, because my heart would throb less painful there, being caked with cold and past the smart of feeling. And where I walked, the murderous winter blast would have this body bowed, these eyeballs streaming. And though I think this heart's blood froze not fast, it ran too small to spare one drop for dreaming. Dear love, these fingers that had known your touch and tied our separate forces first together were 10 poor idiot fingers, not worth much, 10 frozen parsnips hanging in the weather. Well, I can assure you that this full version is much better than the strangled sonnet that has recently appeared online, and nobody knows who added the final couplet to create a sonnet. I love that poem. I think it's a beautifully written poem. It has great rhyming lines in it. And they fit well. There's no fake rhymes that are just there to make them rhyme. They're all an integral part of the process of the poem. Better to walk forth in the frozen air and wash my wound in the snows. That would be healing, because my heart would throb lest painful there, being caked with cold and past the smart of feeling. The frozen air and the painful there lines rhymed, and then the next rhymes, that would be healing and the smart of feeling. The second and fourth lines have perfect rhymes that go along with the poem in every way. Okay, that's John Crowe Ransom, some of his best work. And you can see that he specializes in irony, but that his poems battled against the impression that Southern poetry is somehow sentimental, because it isn't sentimental at all. In fact, my own poetry is more likely to be struck with that handle than his is. And speaking of my poetry, I'm going to read you two poems that I wrote in the past few years. One of them is called Snowflakes. It certainly fits the weather here because we had spitting snow all night last night, off and on. And they look just like what I'm describing in this poem. Floating, lifting, falling, scooting, like a hatch of insects over a trout stream, flakes finally find their way to the surface, instantly disappearing as if entering another dimension. Sun, sputtering through intermittent clouds, lights them on their way. Some freakish flakes appear with long tails, not females, not males, like nothing solid in our view of nature, no flake like any other. Small, intricate images, fluttering in front of my window like fall flies wanting in. The season's first snow, unserious, not accumulating, not melting, not freezing. A premonition of what may and will come. This is winter. This is their home. The snowflakes are an inexhaustible source of poetry since time immemorial. And this is my answer to that endless library of poems about snow and snowflakes. Now then, here's a poem which has to do with a new focus that's come on in the past few years as a result of the pandemic. And the epigram of this poem is taken from a CDC warning. It says, "It is strongly recommended that masks be worn around all others." I'm looking at you in a new way. Your eyes, your lashes, and your brows, the lines in your forehead when you laugh replace the flare of your nostrils and the curl of your lip. I see you have cut a slit in your mask so you can sip your coffee. Is there lipstick on your cup? I need to see if it's really you here with me. My eyes are beset, reset. My brain is reprogrammed. My mind repaints your full face, your smile, the wrinkles at your eyes, and the color of your hair. Curls or waves are now my focus. I find I must recongregate decades of reading the human face. We are flesh. We are bone. It's only face to face we aren't alone. I think that poem pretty well summarizes the kind of emptiness and loneliness we all felt when we walked down the street. And some people are still masked, but walk down the street and we can't tell who is the person who just waved at us. We have no idea. Okay, thank you for being here to listen to more poetry. And I hope you'll tune in again next week for still more. Bye now.